people on GoToMeeting, please be sure that everything is muted, both the sound and the video, and you use the chat box to communicate and ask questions, but please make sure that you're sending the message only to the organizer. And I'm happy to introduce our brown bag speaker for today, Bethany Wilinski. Bethany is an assistant professor in the Department of Teacher Education at Michigan State University. She draws on critical policy frameworks and employs ethnographic methods to study policy enactment in early childhood settings. In particular, she studies early childhood workforce issues and the lived experiences of pre- and in-service pre-K teachers in the US and in Tanzania. She's the author of When Pre-K Comes to School, Policy Partnerships and the Early Childhood Education Workforce. And her topic today is Pre-K Partnerships, Implications for Teachers and Institutions. So please welcome Bethany.
All right, thanks Rosemary, and hello to everyone joining us virtually. Okay. Great. Well, it's so great to see so many people coming out interested to think about early childhood education and perhaps pre-K policy more specifically. I'm delighted to be here, and I'm really grateful for the opportunity to speak with all of you today. So like Rosemary said, my work, I'm interested in policy enactment, particularly in public pre-K in the US and then in pre-primary education in Tanzania. And I'm particularly interested in how policy intersects with teachers' daily lives and lived experiences and workplace experiences. And so what I'm going to talk about today is my book that came out in March, and the research came from my dissertation work, which I conducted a year-long study of a new pre-K, the enactment of a new pre-K policy in a school district in Wisconsin. So I'll start by kind of giving you an overview of the study, and then I'm going to do a little bit of context work. And for me, understanding teachers' work and experiences in context is really important, because the implications that I find in my work are really connected to this local context, but also embedded within the context, right, of a district policy, of a state policy context, and then of course within this broader national phenomenon expansion of public pre-K in recent years. So like I said, this was a year-long study where I followed 3 teachers who were working in different kinds of contexts where pre-K was implemented over the course of a school year. As I'll describe later, the settings were really important because Lakeville, which is what I call the district where I conducted the research, in Lakeville, the policy was implemented in a mix through a school community partnership. So it was implemented at a mix of public elementary school and then private childcare sites. So I selected participants who would represent kind of the range of places where this new policy was enacted. And I draw on Bartlett and Vavris's comparative case study design in my research design. So I'm interested in the 3 teachers, right, kind of this middle box. So what's happening for these 3 teachers? So I'm comparing horizontally across these 3 institutions, but then I'm also interested in how that is embedded within other contexts, like I mentioned. So there's the district policy, the state policy, and then down here you see in this design, there's also this transversal element. So thinking about how this is also, the policy is being enacted and experienced at a particular moment in time. So I want to talk just briefly about that moment in time. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this, right? That over the past 15 years or so, there's been a relatively rapid expansion in publicly funded pre-K. And this is based on brain development research and economic research highlighting the benefits of investing in the early years as a time of rapid brain development and cognitive growth. And so as a result, many states have been investing public funds in pre-K, primarily for 4-year-olds. And that's significant because historically in the US, early childhood education is provided in the private sector with the exception of federally funded Head Start. So that's kind of the broader context in which this policy in Wisconsin is happening. So in Wisconsin, education for 4-year-olds is actually part of the state's constitution. So education is guaranteed for children from age 4 to 21. And what this has looked like in Wisconsin over the years, there's a program called 4-year-old kindergarten, or 4K. And the popularity and availability of 4K has kind of ebbed and flowed over time, kind of in response to political pressure and political will, I guess. But since about the 80s, there's been kind of this resurgence in the provision of 4-year-old kindergarten, or pre-K. So what that looks like in Wisconsin, as I'm sure many of you are aware, nationally the pre-K landscape is very varied, right? So there are probably more differences across state programs than there are kind of, it's always interesting when I talk to people, like when I'm doing work in Tanzania, they're like, but tell us about early childhood education in the US. I'm kind of like, I don't know where to start because, well, this is true in Wisconsin, but it's not true in Michigan, and it's different in New York, and it's different in New Jersey. So you can't really say, you know, this is what our system looks like because it's effectively a non-system. Anyway, a little bit of, I digress there. So in Wisconsin, there is universal pre-K for 4-year-olds in districts that choose to have a 4K program. So currently about 96% of Wisconsin school districts do offer pre-K, and when they take state funding for pre-K, they have to make it available to all 4-year-olds in the district. This primarily takes the form of half-day programs, but there is local variation. I just knocked this off of the microphone, does that matter? Okay. And Wisconsin's policy is what I think could be defined as a low regulation policy. So basically at the state level, the policy says pre-K teachers have to have a bachelor's degree plus a teaching license that includes pre-K or kindergarten. Pre-K has to be offered for like 437 hours a year. You have to provide transportation. But beyond that, there are districts decide. Okay, so it's very much local control in terms of what pre-K winds up looking like, what what the curriculum is, where it's housed. So another thing that at the state level, folks in Wisconsin would tell you is that Wisconsin is very committed to this idea of school community partnerships. So there's a program called, or a way of doing pre-K that they call the 4K community approach. And this was pioneered in I think the year 2000, where kind of the first school district said, we want to do pre-K and we're going to work with the local childcare community and a range of stakeholders to develop what pre-K should look like in our context. And so, so at the state level, there's this promotion of the community approach where although the funding has to flow through the school district, pre-K can be enacted through these school community partnerships where you might have a combination of classrooms in elementary schools and private childcares, preschools, that sort of thing, or pre-K might be provided entirely outside of school district buildings and only be provided in the childcare community. The other option, of course, and an option that many rural school districts tend to enact, is where you would have pre-K only housed in the public elementary school. So what did pre-K look like in Lakeville then? Lakeville was kind of a late adopter of pre-K, and part of it is because there was a pretty strained political history of trying to formulate a pre-K policy in this particular district. So I think by the time the policy began in fall 2011, it had been about 10 years in the making, and some people said that, you know, there was blood on the pavement coming home from these meetings, trying to negotiate what pre-K would look like, and those were negotiations between kind of the early childhood community in the district, the teachers union, and the school district. What everyone finally agreed on is that pre-K would be enacted through the school community partnership, where no more than 49% of pre-K slots would be housed in childcare or preschool. So the rest, just over half, would have to be kept in the public elementary schools. Like the state policy, teachers needed a bachelor's degree in teaching certification to be qualified to teach pre-K. The other thing that the district decided, which is important, is that private providers who would provide pre-K had to already meet certain quality standards. So they had to be either accredited by NAEYC or by the city of Lakeville. And that was a bit of a point of contention because the early childhood community had originally thought, you know, maybe the pre-K dollars could be used to improve the quality of some of these childcare providers. But in the end, the decision was that you had to meet certain quality benchmarks in order to be a pre-K partner. And I'll talk later about why that became important. So in Lakeville, it was a half-day program that operated Monday through Thursday in the public schools, it was Tuesday through Friday. Mondays were reserved for teachers planning and professional development. The childcare providers had more flexibility in determining the hours that pre-K was provided, but they couldn't offer it for full days, and that was also important in some sites. The pre-K time had to be free, so if pre-K was embedded within kind of a full day wraparound program, that became kind of a complicating factor for administrators trying to figure out, you know, do we give parents some sort of a tuition break for those pre-K hours or not? And the curriculum was, in the public school sites, the creative curriculum was used, but for the community partner sites, they had the flexibility to identify a play-based curriculum that fit with their mission and philosophy. And then finally, there was an assessment that was created by the district. So there was a progress report that was designed by a group of school district officials and early childhood stakeholders that mirrored the elementary school report cards. So like I said, my research focused on teachers who were working at 3 different types of places where the policy was implemented. So Grace Calden was a teacher at Forest Grove Elementary, a local pre-K to 2 elementary school building. She had been teaching kindergarten for 15 years there prior to the start of pre-K. And one of the things, as I was selecting in sites and teachers, I purposefully selected teachers who had been in their sites prior to the introduction of the pre-K policy, because I wanted to understand how, if at all, they perceived change in their institution or in their work as a result of the implementation of the new policy. So Grace was, as she described it, moved down to pre-K when the policy began to be implemented. She was initially not happy about that. She really loved teaching kindergarten and was kind of unsure about this new world of pre-K with learning centers and that sort of thing in a different format. But she wound up really loving it. And she was also really excited because the school district gave them a whole slew of new materials for their classroom when pre-K started. Friendship Preschool was a part-day private preschool. It served a pretty affluent community, and so it's kind of one of the elite preschools, I would say, in the district. And it had a really strong institutional identity. So they were their mantra almost was, we've been doing this for 50 years. Like, we're really good at play-based early childhood education, and we know what we're doing, right? And so incidentally, we happen to also be doing pre-K, but really, like, what we're doing is this really high quality play-based early childhood. So Linda Jenkins was the focal teacher there. She had been working at Friendship Preschool as a 3-year-old teacher for about 7 years prior to the introduction of the policy. And then when pre-K came to school, as it were, she was one of the few teachers in the building who was qualified to teach pre-K. So she got moved up to the pre-K classroom so that they kind of shifted teachers around because she had the proper credentials to teach it. The last site was Bright Start Child Care Center, and the focal teacher there was Megan Stevenson. Bright Start Child Care Center was a for-profit corporate child care center that was heavily bureaucratic and a place that Megan described as very focused on labor and the bottom line. So very different kind of community partner site setting than Friendship Preschool. Megan had relatively recently finished her degree in early childhood education and had been working at Bright Start ever since. So she had about 2 or 3 years of experience, and she had prior to this been the 4-year-old teacher. So she was kind of doing pre-K before it officially became publicly funded pre-K. Okay, so now I want to talk about the implications of the policy. And I would say that when I was doing the research and designing the study, I was really focused on the teachers. And then as as the year progressed and I learned more about what was happening, and I went to school board meetings and these district-wide pre-K meetings, I began to understand more about the effects of the policy, not just for the teachers, but also the institutions they were embedded in. And I should backtrack. I think I didn't say much about kind of the research that I did generally. So it was a year-long ethnographic study following these 3 focal teachers. And I did classroom observations in each room over the course of the year. I did about 100 hours of observation in each classroom. I also interviewed each of the focal teachers 3 times, as well as their administrators, other early childhood stakeholders in the district. And then I attended what I called policy events. So these were staff meetings at each institution, the teachers' planning meetings. There were these district-wide pre-K meetings where people were kind of, what one director called building the plane while flying it, figuring out what the policy was as they were enacting it, basically. And so one limitation of the study was that I was never able to interview any of the school district officials. So my understanding of kind of the school district perspective comes from these public meetings that I was able to attend, as well as policy documents. So what did the policy mean for these institutions in which the teachers were embedded? First, the teachers and administrators talked about having this formal pre-K policy that tied pre-K to the K-12 system, provided some sort of validation and recognition for the work that they were doing. So they saw it as kind of this, we've already been doing pre-K in this district, right? It's not like pre-K is something new, but the fact that it's publicly funded and that it's attached to the public schools in some way is new. And they saw that as a positive because it kind of gave the community a better sense of the importance of early childhood education, showed people that pre-K and early childhood is not just glorified babysitting. And particularly for the corporate child care center, that administrator said, this kind of proves to everyone that we're as good as the rest of them. She felt like there was a stigma against for-profit or corporate childcare, and because they were considered of high enough quality to be a pre-K provider, that provided some validation that, like, oh yeah, people can recognize we're just as good as the rest of them. But there were also some downsides. And one of those was there was an economic downside. So anyone who is familiar with early childhood education knows that in childcare, your profit base is not infants and toddlers. Well, first, right, there's not a ton of money in childcare. But second, for the younger children are, the lower ratio you need to support those classes. And so what happened in Lakeville is, you have the introduction of this new universal pre-K policy, this program that's open to any 4-year-olds in the district. You have some providers who are high quality enough to be able to partner with the school district to provide it. And then you have other providers who are not, who don't have the option of being one of these partner sites. And what happened for those providers is they saw, some of them saw a pretty significant drop in their enrollment of 4-year-olds. And it became very difficult for them to figure out how they would keep their doors open if all of these 4-year-olds were kind of being siphoned out of their program and into the pre-K program. So there were examples of even some more elite preschools that, like Friendship, they were qualified to be pre-K providers, but in the first year of the policy, they kind of said, no, we value our Montessori approach too much to let it be kind of, we're not going to let the school district's program impinge on that or change us in any way. So we're going to stay out of public pre-K, we'll continue to offer our program, and we trust the parents will continue to come because they value what we provide. But a year later, those same institutions were applying to be part of the pre-K program because they were losing parents. And as one of the administrators, the Friendship Preschool administrator said, people's budgets are people's budgets, particularly if you only need part-day care. You can get it for free at any number of really great centers. So why would people then continue to pay in these other places that aren't part of pre-K? So some institutions had the ability to then join pre-K, right, to become a pre-K provider. For others, though, they were caught in a much more tenuous situation, right? They, for whatever reason, weren't able to meet the quality standards needed to be a pre-K provider. And so they were kind of struggling to figure out if they could stay afloat or not, if they could keep their doors open. Another challenge that was experienced particularly by the part day providers was that the per child reimbursement they received from the district was not always sufficient to cover the costs of providing the program. So at Friendship Preschool, Denise Sanderson, who is the administrator, said they'd basically come up with these creative ways to make up the difference. So the district provided about $3,500 per child to the private providers who were implementing the program. The district got more than that from the state, and no one was quite sure, where the other $1,000 or $2,000 per child was going. But there was some suspicion on the part of the child care providers and some questioning of, wait, why isn't more of that coming to us? This isn't really covering our costs. And so at Friendship, what they wound up doing was creating this kind of a la carte menu of things parents could add on to the pre-K day. So, you could stay 45 minutes later, and that was when, all of the kids went out on the playground for the second time. It wasn't the only time they played outside. Or you could add on lunch bunch, right? And so they kind of created these different ways to entice parents to extend the kids' part day school day in a way that could help them make up the difference between the district reimbursement and their actual costs of administering the program. And then for the public schools, and this was the case, so I studied the policy in the second year of its implementation, so I'm not confident that this is still the case, but at least initially, there's this kind of cost sharing mechanism. So when a school district decides to implement pre-K, they have to help with put up some of the funds over the first 3 years. And so one of the ways that played out in public school buildings was that they didn't receive additional funding for pre-K kids who needed special education services or English language learner support. And so the principal at Forest Grove talked about the fact that she had this new group of kids in her building, and many of them had needs that had to be accommodated for. And she had the same, her support staff hadn't changed, and so now she was stretching her special education and her English language learner support to cover more kids in the building. And so that became difficult, right, to accommodate the needs of all the students in the building when there was not additional funding coming in for it. And then there were implementation challenges that were pretty particular to the community providers. And part of this, I think, stemmed from the fact that the policy was really created with a public school in mind, with a public school that has some support staff in the building, that has access to resources that not all childcare providers have access to, and that operates at a level of scale that, quite frankly, these small businesses don't operate at. And so this came up particularly in issues of finding substitute teachers and also administering state mandated assessments. So the issue with substitute teachers was that the community providers technically had access to the school district pool of substitute teachers. Substitute teachers had to also have the teaching license, right, the same as the pre-K teachers. But when the district sent out an email to the substitute teacher pool and said, okay, we have pre-K, who would like to be on the pre-K sublist? One person said they wanted to do that. And the community sites could not afford to pay substitute teachers the daily rate that the district paid them at. So again, they talked about coming up with creative solutions. Again, at Friendship Preschool, they were able to kind of draw on, there were maybe some parents who have flexible work schedules, who had the credentials, they could bring them in. There was all this talk of like, how do we move bodies in buildings, right? So that we have coverage, we're still staying in ratio, all these things. But it's just one of these examples where, it was a pretty significant stretch for the community providers to be able to be in compliance with this policy requirement. In the corporate child care center, Megan, the pre-K teacher, was the only one in her entire building, including her administrators, that had the credentials needed to teach pre-K. So I said, well, what do you do if you get sick? She's like, well, I'm hoping I don't get sick, but maybe, maybe there's another teacher at one of our other Bright Start centers in the district who could come sub for me if that were the case. And then at the end of the school year, when I was conducting the research, Wisconsin decided that the PALS, the Phonological Awareness Literacy Screener, would be administered to children in pre-K twice a year. And this caused a huge uproar in the child care community, the pre-K partner sites. People were really concerned both just about the assessment in general, but then about how do we do this in our program? Like, this is a pretty labor-intensive assessment to administer. It requires, something like 45 minutes. They recommend the child is taken out of the classroom. It has to all be completed within this 2-week window. And they basically had this meeting with school district officials where they said, we don't have the capacity to do this. This is really hard for us, again, because unlike in the public elementary schools, so the public elementary schools did not have to adhere to any student-teacher ratios. But of course, because of childcare licensing standards, folks in the community centers did. So I want to just read you an excerpt from this meeting, because I think it highlights kind of this fundamental disconnect between the way the district is thinking about policy implementation and the reality of what it's like to do this in a child care site or preschool. So, and kind of the background is that the PALS had already been required in, I think, kindergarten and first grade, so the district had some experience with implementing it. So they were kind of bringing that to the childcare community, saying, like, we've already done this. We'll tell you what we've done in the past. So the district official explains that in kindergarten classrooms, they've had a team of people who are trained to administer the PALS. Each person administers one part of the assessment. So one person would do letter recognition with all the kids, and the other would do rhyming with all the kids, for example. So Denise Sanderson, the administrator of Friendship Preschool, says, so they pull the kids out of the room. Yes, Denise. And who is doing this? Who is the team you're talking about? School district official says, the school psychologists and teaching coaches. Basically, whoever the school has available. Sanderson. And if the school has no team? The school district official turns to her colleague and says, Eric, can you answer that? And he says, you just have to think about who at the site can be trained. Sanderson says, we have all of our teachers with the kids all the time, so we would have to have a sub. School district official says, some schools have used subs. This pre-K teacher chimes in, are you going to pay for the subs? And the school district official says, no, that's why we're talking about this early. Don't panic yet. We're being very proactive now. That was not a really satisfying response for the teachers and administrators who were, again, panicking over, wait, we're assessing the kids more. We already thought we were doing enough assessment. And then how are we going to actually do this in our schools? And, you know, by the way, they have this issue with getting subs anyway. So then having to get subs to administer assessments, you can imagine, will be another big barrier. So in the end, they wound up doing it. And when I had some email contact with directors and teachers afterwards, and I said, so how did you wind up managing that? And again, there was this coming up with creative solutions, right? Finding people who are qualified to be in the room with kids so that a teacher could pull kids out. Megan at Bright Start said she was really lucky because there was someone in the district who volunteered to come in and be in her classroom while she was administering the assessment. But this, you know, posed a considerable challenge to community sites who were trying to adhere to the requirements of the policy, but just didn't have the resources they needed to do it. So now I want to talk about what the policy meant for teachers. And I would say that when teachers kind of became aware that pre-K was going to happen, again, you know, it had been in the works for 10 years, so people were like, is it happening, is it not? And it finally became clear that it's happening. There was a lot of excitement, right? They're like, for some of the same reasons that the institutions were excited about it. This could elevate the status of early childhood professionals, showing the community like this, we're doing something really important here, it's to be valued. They were excited because there was the prospect of getting a job in the public schools, right? So Lakeville happens to be a district where a lot of people want to live and a lot of people want to teach. So, you know, for every open teaching position or teaching spot, you might get 200 or 300 applicants. So you wind up having a lot of people working in childcare settings who are qualified to teach in elementary schools and are kind of biding their time, right? Doing something, trying to get into an elementary school position. So teachers like Megan and Linda saw this as an opportunity. Oh, maybe I could finally get that public school job that I was hoping for because there are going to be all of these new jobs created by the policy. They were also really excited about, again, this tying pre-K to K-12 because in their mind it positioned pre-K as real school. And they talked about how they got less pushback from parents about kind of the play-based approaches they were using because parents kind of, in their view, parents were kind of like, oh, if this is a school district program, then it must be okay, right? So they didn't, at back to school night, parents weren't like, why aren't you sending home worksheets and things like that. They felt that parents trusted them more because they were now associated with the school district in this new way. But one of the real challenges for teachers was that the introduction of pre-K did not eliminate huge disparities in compensation and working conditions across the sites. So I said that teachers were excited that they might be able to get public school jobs, right? In reality, when pre-K was introduced, it didn't open up a lot of positions because the school district kind of rearranged people. So we had Grace Calden, who has moved from kindergarten to pre-K. They're also, I don't know if they're, you know, urban myths or not, but people would say, and did you hear, you know, one high school physics teacher got moved down to pre-K, and there's all this, can you believe it? The school district, you know, this is so terrible. They're just randomly reassigning people to teach these young kids. But the reality of the situation was it didn't, you know, it didn't provide this opportunity for advancement for folks in childcare sites. And then you had, so there are already salary discrepancies, right, between folks working in public elementary schools and people working in childcare. And while the introduction of public funds for pre-K was thought initially, well, that might boost salaries at childcare sites for pre-K teachers. Again, because remember I talked about how the district reimbursement didn't necessarily cover the cost of operating the program. That didn't really materialize for people. So I think Linda did not get a raise, and Megan finally got a 2% cost of living raise, which meant she was making $14.28 an hour during the year the research was conducted, versus the public elementary school teacher who was making $52,000 a year, with retirement and health benefits and that sort of thing. So the teachers were really aware of this, and basically it perpetuated a system where teachers in the childcare sites were, at least these two teachers, were constantly trying to get out of childcare, even though they were teaching public pre-K, trying to get out of those settings and into the school district positions. And so by the end of the research year, both Megan and Linda had secured positions in the elementary school. And so that leads to issues, right, of teacher turnover, which we know diminishes program quality. So the school district this policy kind of set up or maybe intensified some of this churn of teachers moving from childcare to public school, because there was no kind of regulation or mandate about teacher salaries. Finally, teachers were very aware that there was embedded in this policy was access to professional development. So public school teachers had monthly professional development workshops that they were required to attend. These were also technically available to the pre-K teachers in the childcare sites, but they were held on Monday afternoon at 1 p.m. And so you can imagine that makes it really difficult for folks who are working 7:30 to 4:30 and are responsible for being with kids the whole time to get out and attend that professional development. And so this was really seen as a huge drawback for the teachers working in the community sites. They wanted to be part of this group of pre-K teachers. They wanted to have conversation about practice with colleagues. They wanted to kind of have this network, and they weren't able to access it easily. Linda went on her own time because she kind of said, I'm a lifelong learner. I want to be part of this. And she only worked part day, so she could do it. Megan was less able to attend, although her site did allow her to go a few times, which seemed pretty unusual given their focus on kind of labor hours and things like that. So again, it was an example of this policy that is, I think, trying to be inclusive, right, and bring together two different, pre-K teachers across these different locations, but that wasn't really attuned to the realities of working in childcare or preschool settings. And so just for kind of the last point I want to make, I want to just zoom in to each teacher and give you just a little bit of a sense of what it was like for them specifically in the context of their own institutions. So again, even though there were patterns and similarities across some of the teachers and also differences, the type of context they were in really mattered for the way that they experienced pre-K. So for Grace, who is again teaching in the public elementary school, the experience of teaching pre-K was one of extreme isolation. She had been in her school for 15 years prior to this, but when she became a pre-K teacher, she suddenly felt very marginalized and isolated from the rest of her, from her colleagues and the rest of her building. The most obvious manifestation of this was the fact that her classroom was located in the basement of the school in a windowless storage closet. So over the first couple months of the pre-K year, she basically clawed her way back up to the first floor, but then the next year was moved back down to the basement. So she, one of the things she said, it's frustrating to be in a building and feel like you're not really a part of it. You're there, you're taking up space, kind of like you got to be someplace, so there you are. So her principal saw pre-K as a school district program that happened to be in her building. She didn't see those pre-K kids as kind of her kids. the way enrollment worked, kids didn't necessarily, you could attend any pre-K program, right? Even at the public schools, you didn't have to be in the attendance area in order to enroll. So a lot of kids went to this particular elementary school. It had a dual language immersion program, and parents thought if they went to pre-K in that building, they had a better chance of getting into the DLI program. The principal said this wasn't true, but basically, and then there was another sister school busing arrangement that meant that basically the principal did not see the pre-K kids as her kids, and the pre-K program as her program. So Grace's perception and experience was that the principal hardly ever came into her classroom. She didn't, ever say, hey, what's going on, or stop and talk to kids while they were in workshops. And what Grace really wanted was just some acknowledgement, some recognition, some collegiality, or, recognition on the part of her principal and the other teachers in her building that what she was doing was important and worthwhile. Megan at the Corporate Child Care Center actually saw her status increase at her building. And part of that was because, like I said, she was the only person in the building qualified to teach pre-K. So what she saw was kind of her administrators really trying to keep her happy in a sense. And these were, I have to say, like very little things, like getting more planning time than other people, but they were really significant. So she said, I guess I get more planning time than a lot of other teachers. I'm usually first on the planning time list, which is helpful because the director knows I don't get that nap time, and he knows there's a lot more involved with pre-K. So again, not hugely significant. I told you she's making $14.28 an hour, but her planning time was pretty sacred because, again, of this perception, like pre-K is something different. She needs that planning time. Her schedule is slightly different than the other teachers. Megan was also able to negotiate other things. Like I said, she was able to have paid access to these professional development sessions. And then the summer after I did the research, she had negotiated kind of a more part-time work schedule so she could teach in the summer school in the school district, which is ultimately what I think led to her getting hired by the school district. And I think her administrators were okay with that because she had kind of come to occupy this special space within her building. Linda was frustrated. So her administrator was very set on the fact that pre-K was not going to change anything in her building, and we're not kind of giving our pre-K teachers more than others because first and foremost we are friendship preschool, right? And the institutional identity trumps this kind of school district stuff that's going on. But Linda really felt like, I'm doing something different, and I thought people were going to get raises when pre-K happened, and why is that not changing for me? And she was really conflicted because she felt she was getting not really close to retirement, but closer to retirement, and she was concerned. She said, I just can't see myself being 60 years old and crawling around under the loft with kids. How am I going to have some security in retirement? And so she was really focused on the fact that community sites needed to try to get the school district to up their reimbursement so that those salary increases could happen. So she said community sites need to push for getting a little bit more money so we can keep up with salaries. I'm not saying we have to be equal with the public schools, but I'd like a little more equity. So she, like the other teachers, she was very aware of the fact that she was doing pretty much the exact same job, had the exact same qualifications, and yet was earning far less than the public school teachers, and felt like this should be reconciled in some way, even though it made her profoundly uncomfortable to talk about that or to think about how that might shift the dynamics within her own institution. So in conclusion, I guess I want to think a little bit about the ways that I think policy can make pre-K a better place for kids and teachers. And I think we tend to talk a lot about child outcomes associated with early childhood education and talk a little bit less about the teachers who are so important to pre-K fulfilling the promises, right, fulfilling all that it sets out to do. And so again, that's part of the reason that I focus on teachers, because I feel like their voices need to be heard and their experiences need to be known. So I think, you know, Lakeville's policy was an example, like I said, of something that was not quite attuned to what the early childhood ecosystem looked like. Even though it was kind of co-created by early childhood stakeholders and the school district, I think the policy could have done a better job accounting for and adapting to the potential economic impacts of the introduction of pre-K, and particularly a universal program, right? You might not have those same issues in a targeted program, but there certainly were big ramifications for sites that were not able to be pre-K providers. I think there's a need, and there are some states and programs that do this, to think about the additional supports that community partners might need to meet policy requirements. So policy needs to not assume that everyone has access to the same resources and that requirements are easily met by anyone who's implementing pre-K, particularly when it's implemented through this partnership model. Of course, there are issues of compensation, benefits, and working conditions, right? So Megan talked about the fact that because she was doing pre-K in a childcare setting, she was with kids all the time, right? She had no time to kind of no duty-free lunch, which we know in public elementary school that doesn't necessarily mean you're sitting and having a duty-free lunch, but at least she thought, the public school pre-K teachers have some more control of their time, whereas I'm here until 6 and I'm supervising kids, and it made her feel less valued as a pre-K teacher. So I think, we need to think carefully about how we're recognizing and valuing the work that teachers do in terms of compensation, benefits, and working conditions. And then finally, and this is something I didn't really talk about, but that I'd be happy to talk about in the Q&A, is policy needs to address issues of access. So in Lakeville, the pre-K program was open to anyone, and you could technically enroll in any pre-K site in the district, but in reality, there were fewer sites that were located in low-income neighborhoods. And transportation was only provided to public elementary school sites, and the public elementary schools did not provide wraparound care. So if you're a family who needs transportation and needs wraparound care, you don't really have access to public pre-K. Also, if you're a family who is not affluent and hasn't been able to, let's say, send your child to a place like Friendship Preschool, from the age of 2 or whatever, you might not be able to access some of these more elite sites because many of them had requirements or prioritized admission to pre-K to families who had already been enrolled at the site. So families needed a certain amount of social and cultural capital in order to really navigate the system, even though it's technically universally accessible. So I just want to conclude by saying, I guess the caveat to all of this is I think pre-K is really important. I think it's really important that we support pre-K and we support pre-K teachers. And I think that partnerships, schools and communities working together can work really well. But I also want to highlight some of the challenges that come along with that. So I don't want the takeaway of this talk to be kind of an indictment of public pre-K or of partnerships, but just to say that I think policies can kind of be better in tune to the needs of the community providers particularly, and the teachers who are implementing these policies and programs. Thank you all for being such an attentive audience, and I look forward to your questions. Yeah, Steve.
I'm not sure it's not an indictment of public pre-K, at least as it operates in Wisconsin. I wonder, to what extent would based on your your work and observation, to what extent do you think that the inattention to these problems and even the things that create them, like I'm kind of astounded at how much of the money doesn't make it to the provider.
Mm-hmm.
How much of this is, I mean, I get a sense, but you didn't really talk about it, that fundamentally they don't care about educating the kids.
Mm.
Why would you put them in a basement with no windows? It sounds like punishment.
And it felt like punishment to that teacher. Oh, sure. So the question is, the statement is, it does sound like an indictment, and it sounds like the district doesn't really care about educating the kids in terms of the amount of money they pass on.
And do you have a sense of, is that perception wrong, or would you say they don't really think about educating the kids?
Sure. And do I have a sense of whether that perception is wrong, or do they really not think about educating the kids? So I think part of the challenge is that, at least in Wisconsin, it's so local, it's so district by district. So I'll give you kind of a counter example, right? There is a district, I was doing a study with Sharon Ryan and Beth Grau and Kate, and we were in another school district that was using a community approach it was a smaller school district. It was kind of a suburban district, whereas Lakeville was in a small urban district. And they were also using a community approach, but they had taken a very different approach to creating and enacting their policy. So they had spent 6 years developing this policy, and that's, 6 years actually developing it, not 10 years in Lakeville having political fights and, blood on the pavement and that sort of thing. And they had kind of brought all of the stakeholders together. And from what I understand from talking to officials in that district, they had really kind of prioritized the needs of kids and families over the needs of institutions and developed. And so what pre-K looked like in that district was it was implemented in 6 community sites only. And then there was some connection to the public schools because there were elementary school principals that were kind of point people for those community sites. Excuse me. But I don't know how much of the state reimbursement they passed on specifically, but they did require the sites to pay their pre-K teachers, I think 80% of the district salary scale, so they didn't require the exact same compensation as the public school employees. But I guess that was an example of a place where the policy seemed to be more focused on kids and families and their needs and less focused on maybe the district getting, increasing its revenue by providing pre-K, because that's, I think, one way that Lakeville's policy could potentially be seen, right? You're getting more kids into your district. There was a little bit of a pressure on the district to start pre-K because 5 or 6 surrounding districts already had pre-K, so that meant that if Lakeville didn't do it, their kids were going to start open enrolling out into other districts and then potentially not come back to Lakeville for kindergarten. It was a really, from what I've heard, I wasn't able to observe any of the negotiations, a very tense negotiation with the teachers union over jobs. So the union was very concerned that the pre-K policy would bring jobs out of the public schools, and so that was the reason for this. Only 49% of slots can be in childcare sites. So did they not care about educating kids? That's a really tough question. I think the school district was not terribly transparent about the decisions that it was making in terms of how the reimbursements were calculated and funneled to the childcare sites. I guess I would hate to say they didn't care about educating kids, but there was certainly a lot that was getting in the way of providing kids in the district with these high quality experiences, or at least supporting their teachers really well. Is that a satisfying response at all? Okay. Yes.
First of all, I'd like to say I think you're doing really important work.
Thank you.
It's really exciting.
Thanks.
I have a question about the whole problem or issue of bringing pre-K into the public school.
Mm-hmm.
It seems as though we're really talking about two profoundly different cultures. And just as one can ask, are they really interested in educating kids? One can flip that around and say, are the public schools really interested in caring for kids? And children there needs to be some thought given to like the issue of wraparound care. I guess I'm curious about the degree to which you saw the school district actually changing in response to mandate to provide pre-K, and maybe you didn't get it, you weren't able to get it in perspective on that. That's just
Yeah, well, yeah, so the question is about whether I saw the school district changing in response to to pre-K and kind of shifting and how it would accommodate pre-K students, or and then I would say, so it's not that I didn't have time to interview school district officials, they wouldn't agree to be interviewed. And at a certain point, you kind of get the hint and stop, sending polite emails and bumping into people at meetings. So yeah, so I did try.
I didn't say this clearly, but it's not just caring for kids from the perspective of school here. There's an issue about how you educate children, and shifting the curriculum is certainly an important part of that. But play is a much more sensible approach with curriculums. But you just need to think about physical environments differently. You need to think about the number of people that need to be in the classroom differently. And I think New Jersey addressed some of these issues. Like there was a deal about we need to have bathrooms in the classrooms. Little things like that, but they represent the culture of the places, and it seems like we need to do something about that.
Yeah. So the question is also about kind of curriculum, and is what I'm hearing is kind of broadly about alignment in some way, but making sure that public school buildings are places that fit with like an early child, or where an early childhood model can fit in. Yeah, and I think this was a huge problem in Lakeville actually, because the district kind of exempted itself from, so on the one hand they said, well, in order to be a community provider, you have to meet NAEYC and City of Lakeville accreditation standards, which includes things like family style meals, right? And student teacher ratios and things like, right, all sorts of things that we believe we know contributes to quality in early childhood education. And the school district basically said, no, we're not doing that. We're requiring community providers to be held to that standard, but in the elementary school buildings, we don't have to be held to that standard. We are not following even state licensing regulations for early childhood settings. And so at Forest Grove, the bathroom was down the hall. So there were kind of group toileting time, right? Parading down to the bathroom. There was, one of the people I interviewed was a City of Lakeville kind of childcare official, someone who went out and visited and helped with the city accreditation. And she said, she was in this one pre-K classroom. It was a community provider where they were implementing pre-K, but they had hired, one of the options was you could hire a school district teacher, and they would put the school district teacher in your building. And so they were a school district employee, but in this childcare site. And the accreditor said, well, you really should be having kids serve themselves family style. And she said, well, we don't have enough time for that. That just takes too long. And the details of this are blurring now, but for some reason the accreditor couldn't, because it was a school district employee, she couldn't enforce that. And so she said, I feel like I'm powerless to kind of ensure that places are following requirements and doing things that we know contribute to quality and to kids learning. And so if she's saying that about, we don't have time for kids to do family style meals, like what else are they leaving out basically? Does she not have time to have the high quality interactions you should be having with kids, that sort of thing. So I think the district did kind of, perhaps because it was convenient and less expensive, right? It would be more expensive to maintain. I think in Wisconsin it's a 12 or 13 to 1 ratio for 4-year-olds, whereas in some of the classrooms they had 16 or 18 kids with 1 teacher, and maybe a para, but that wasn't always available. And then the curriculum issue was also interesting because the district really took this stance of like, we're using a play-based curriculum, it's creative curriculum, but then the teachers and administrators saw this kind of fundamental misalignment between using creative curriculum and teaching strategies gold, and then this district progress report where they had to give kids scores from 1 to 4 and whether they were, not meeting expectations or exceeding expectations. And one of the administrators said this to me multiple times, like, how can you exceed at play? Like, how do we give kids a 4 at playing? How do you measure that? But it was, the district wanted this alignment, and part of the alignment was we need a progress report in pre-K that makes sense in elementary school. But it didn't make sense to the teachers, because then it also was like, you had to write in how high a child can rote count. And the teachers are like, well, one day this kid can rote count to 35, and the next day I'm stopping them at 100. It just kind of depends on the day, right? And how do you assess in that way, in a way that's authentic? So that's something else teachers struggled with. Like, how do you, they're much more used to observational assessments and developmental portfolios, and this kind of flew in the face of what they were used to and what they considered best practice in early childhood. Yeah, and I would say the other thing, I think this definitely raised issues of, I think there is often an assumption that pre-K, that alignment is really a smart thing and that pre-K will fit really well in public schools. And it's great because then kids get kind of more socialized into school. They know the school building. They're more ready for kindergarten in that sense. But I think, Grace's experience also highlighted for me some of the fundamental misalignment and the ways that even just having a teacher who's on a very different schedule from the rest of the building eliminates opportunity to have those important conversations with kindergarten teachers, for example. So actually that inspired the research that I'm doing right now in Michigan. We're doing an interview study of probably what will be about 40 or 50 teachers who are teaching pre-K in public school buildings and trying to get a sense of their experiences, the types of supports they have, and ultimately hoping to say something about how those teachers can better be supported and how early childhood practices can be better incorporated into the fabric of an elementary school without kind of fundamentally changing the way early childhood looks. Yeah.
In terms of like policy implications, you can say that, what would you say should be the priority? Expanding access or providing access to high quality? Because I think you bring up this tension.
Mm-hmm. So the question is, where should the priority be in terms of policy? Should it be expanding access or expanding access to high quality preschool? Is that?
Yeah, expanding access or keeping high standards for quality.
Yeah, but that's, I don't like to have to choose just one thing that I think we should focus on. I think the way that I'm going to go back to teachers. I mean, I think there's so many important things that you could do to improve the quality, and part of it is just spending, right? And then how funds are allocated. But I think if we're really concerned with quality and with pre-K doing what it's supposed to do, teacher compensation and teacher, like, figuring out ways that teachers will go into pre-K, not as kind of a, I'm doing this until I can get something better, kind of a stopover, but where people want to be early childhood professionals and pre-K professionals and where their work is valued. And I think school districts, it seems, so from the work I'm doing in Michigan now, I'm seeing some areas where I feel like school districts aren't understanding that if they invested in this program, it might actually make a big difference later on, right? And so one quick example is in one district in Michigan, there's currently a negotiation going on between the school district and the teachers union over compensation for preschool teachers. And basically the district is proposing to create a separate salary scale for preschool teachers that will be capped at $35,000 a year. So you are a school district employee, but because you teach preschool, you're on this lower salary scale, and then everyone else will be kind of on the normal scale. And so I think that's highly problematic, right? Because it's saying something, sending a very clear message to future teachers. You know, either don't go into early childhood education or don't be a teacher, an early childhood teacher in this district. And it's also saying something, you know, the work in K-12 is more important than the work that preschool teachers are doing. And so I guess, you know, given my own focus on the workforce, I would say a really important place to start would be thinking about how we're treating teachers. And it, you know, and it's not just compensation, right? It's also kind of the recognition that they're getting and the way they're valued by their, you know, do they have administrators who understand anything about early childhood education and can support them in the work that they're doing? Or are they kind of like Grace, just existing on this island doing a program that happens to be in this particular building? I've explained everything so well that no one has any other questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
All right, thanks everyone.
I have to say that's amazing how they would actually say what the preschool teachers.
Yeah.
I don't know which is worse. Coming right out and saying it, or just
Right. I mean, that's